this is the bit that no one is talking about, which in essence is the whole thing that powers this new world that we're going to be operating in is data. And AI will be the facilitator of that data. I know even the role of digital wallets in terms of how we store that data. So, to answer your question, I think it's the engine that's actually going to power all of these virtual physical worlds, be it digital twins, be it virtual cities, or even our augmented world, is all going to be personalized, is all going to be driven, by all of this.
Michael Clark, thank you so much for joining us here on Real Vision. How are you today?
Very good, and it's a real pleasure to be here. Honestly, it's a real thrill, I have to say.
It's a thrill for me too, and I am deeply excited about the conversation we are about to have, because and all the viewers out there know, that at Real Vision, we're just deeply obsessed with the exponential age, with this profound shift that technology is taking us through, that we're only at the beginning of right now, and we're only at the beginning of understanding the implications of it. And central to my thinking about the exponential age, and I know a lot of people out there share this thinking, is information, the role of information, the role of data. And essentially, one of my key thoughts is that, how do we characterize the exponential age? It's about the emergence of some kind of unified digital physical field where information becomes a part of the world around us. And before I get ahead of myself, we are going to get into all of that and more. Data is what we are here to talk about, because data is your big obsession. So let's kind of rewind back to the beginning. Let's start right at the beginning. Tell the viewers a little bit about yourself, about the adventure you've been on, because I know it's a really interesting one that winds through, for example, open banking, how you came to this obsession with data, and then we'll really get into it, your big thesis and what you think is going on. But first, tell us a bit about you.
It's really eclectic. So I think like anybody in an exponential age or anything innovative, they have an eclectic background, and I'm no different. So I've been lucky. I worked across all my career from acquisition all the way through to manage. So I chose to come from industry, not consulting, which I think broadened my horizon. But then there was always a common thread, which was the role of data. It was almost following me around everywhere like a bad penny. I was lucky to be involved in open banking from the very beginning, helping write strategies for CMA9 banks, but then also building open banking products, as well as then working on really, really large transformations, blockchain, all the cutting edge technologies. But like I said, data was a common thread throughout all of that story, and it's leading us to the conversation we're about to have today.
Yeah, data has been the thread that's woven through so much of what you've done, including with open banking. Tell us then about, and this is a challenge, this is one of those tricky questions, give us your core thesis in a nutshell. Why is data so important? Why are you so obsessed with it? What's happening now, and where is it taking us?
I think data
is a big idea, and then we'll dive in.
So I think the big idea is that data is becoming liquidity. Data in essence is becoming owned by people, and will become the next currency of our time. It will become one of the most dominant things in our lifetime, and is already on that trajectory. The exponential age is the name of this, and that's what we're living in. 6 months ago, nobody had heard of ChatGPT. All of a sudden, it's part of everyday conversation. So my big thesis is that data will become a currency, and it will become owned by the very people that create it, generate it, and use it, which will fundamentally change everything that we know.
Yeah, and I love this idea about data becoming a currency, data essentially becoming its own form of value. And that just taps so deeply into this idea that I keep coming back to when I write about the exponential age, when I talk about it on Real Vision. Something strange is happening to information. The nature of information, what information is, feels to me fundamentally to be changing. And that change underpins so much of what we talk about when it comes to the emergence of the exponential age. So there's our big thesis. Something fundamentally is changing when it comes to the nature of information, and it takes us to a place where information becomes value. Information becomes currency. I might even say information becomes money. I don't know if you would agree with that. let's see if we can get to that place and if we can get to agreement on it. There's our big picture. Now I just want to rewind and go through step by step how we get to that place. And I think I'm right in saying that you would agree with me that it all starts in where we're at now, which is the beginnings of an incredible explosion in data volumes. And people know that this is going on. I think the man in the street and woman in the street knows this is happening, but I don't think they understand the extent of it, the mind-boggling extent of it, or what's driving it really. So talk us through that. Talk us through this huge explosion in data volumes we're seeing now, why that's important.
I think what's happening is that we're seeing data that we've never seen before in our lives. Non-verbal data is now becoming real. It's becoming a digital asset that none of us in our lifetime have ever seen. As human beings, we've never been exposed to it. We interact as people every single day. We operate with non-verbal cues and so on, but it's always been something that's ubiquitous. It's something that just makes us human. What Apple did 2 weeks ago is they made a new channel, and they made data something that effectively is now visible, is now something that we can store, and we can link into human emotion and connect the dots. You hear statistics of, hundreds and hundreds of zettabytes of data by a certain date. But the reality is we're now living in a world where we're going to create around about maybe 74,000 zettabytes of data in huge amounts of time. And this is an age that none of us ever imagined possible.
Yeah. And I think there's a lot going on even in that, because as you say, this data explosion, I mean, to my mind, it has two primary dimensions. First, as you talked about, there's radically new forms of data, like emotional data, facial recognition data, mood data, voice recognition data, and kind of mood patterns in voice, just incredible new forms of data. Then there's the sheer volume, and if you look at the ID, like you said, sort of the landmark iconic forecasts made by the International Data Corporation, the IDC, and it's trotted out all the time, including by me in the past, 175 zettabytes of data by 2025, which is a huge volume. When you think that 1 zettabyte of data, my understanding is, would take like 5 million years or something to download on a household super fast broadband connection. But there are people like Tim Davies, who we've seen on Real Vision in years past, who believe that is a massive underestimate, and that, as you said, there will be tens of thousands of zettabytes of data by 2025, by 2030. And the crucial thing, I think, for people to realize, right, is that it's machines making this data. It's, we're used to a world where people make data. It's going to be machines and objects and buildings making the data now, right?
Yeah, correct. And Tim and I have talked about this often, ironically, and this is how I'm on this podcast, is through my relationship with Tim. The statistics that Holon have anticipated, this data is coming from so many different devices, IoT devices, Internet of Things, headsets, wearables. This data is becoming all around us, completely ubiquitous, and data that we've never, ever touched and seen. And some of the numbers in Tim's reports, which are amazing, by the way, and I highly recommend them, even they only scratch the surface of the world that we're heading into, which I think is going to take many people by surprise, which is kind of the basis of the reason the thesis exists. And the conversations I'm having with regulators and businesses around the world is that, look, this is no longer something you store in a database. This is actually something that's going to be living and breathing and organic. And it's going to be something that's going to be driving economies.
Yeah, exactly. And I just think it's so interesting, and it's profoundly consequential, the way so much of the world around us and so many objects and artifacts in the world around us will become creators of data in ways that most people just aren't thinking about right now. In a world of electric cars and then autonomous vehicles, every car becomes a rolling supercomputer that just streams this tsunami of data about the physical environment. In a world where Amazon are adding like 1,000 robots a day to their warehouses, Amazon fulfillment centers, and that whole infrastructure, again, just streams this tsunami of data constantly. And you end up with just absolutely monumental data volumes. Where do we get to eventually with the connected objects and the Internet of Things? It feels to me that we're heading towards a world where just everything is connected to everything else. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think so. I think I always use the joke that we'll all become nodes, because all of us are generating huge amounts of data. And that's where we're going to end up. We're going to end up where data is going to be becoming like a mist wrapped around us, and it's going to be ubiquitous, always on. We'll connect to it through wallets. This is the world we're heading to, where it's even going to drive markets. And honestly, when you speak to governments, you speak to businesses, they are, I guess, struggling to keep pace with the changes that are among us. And I think, what's going to be coming is already here and is starting to become found. And I think, the world, we're just literally scratching the surface, David, around where this is all heading.
Yeah, right. Because there's, as you've said to me, I think before, a lot of the conversation becomes about sort of simple forms of data processing and data storage, but that's actually just a fraction of the conversation here. When you have volumes at this scale, and when you have the physical environment as a kind of super network of networks, everything constantly streaming data, the nature of data changes and the relationship between the physical world and information changes. And that brings us, I think, to the big second stage, because what is the role that AI plays in all of this? When we have this super network, this, autonomous vehicles, robots, buildings, people with wearable devices, all connected to one another, all streaming data all the time, what role does AI start to play in that world?
So I think AI will transition us to effectively a world where we will move away from acquiring knowledge to using knowledge to make decisions. I think AI will become the augmented worker, and that will basically serve up the knowledge that people need to use to take action and decisions. We hear the talk about AI taking people's jobs, but the reality is, AI is actually going to be augmented and become an employee of the organization.
Hey, sorry to interrupt again. It's Raoul here from Real Vision. I'd love for you to subscribe to the channel, get the notifications. We have so many incredible conversations with so many amazing people. It will really help you in your financial journey and your journey to understand just what the hell's going on in this world. Anyway, click subscribe, get the notifications, and enjoy.
Yeah. And I mean, it's fair to say, right, that this has to, if you have data volumes at this scale, this has to happen. Only AI can handle data volumes at that scale.
Correct. Even if we think about, we'll be moving avatars and visuals that will effectively do that. So, even a 5G world, we'll be moving not just zeros and ones, it'll be images of people, avatars, huge volumes of data that no human will ever be able to read. And our new knowledge worker, unfortunately for the world we're in, we have to be mindful and agree on, is going to be not a human. It's going to be an artificial intelligence machine that is going out there and gathering the insight that a marketing agency would have done a few years ago is now being done by a machine.
Yeah.
And then the human element is, well, what decisions do I need to make on this data? And ultimately, how am I going to use that to drive my business forward? Or if you're a government, how am I going to use this data to make serious decisions of how I want to change the direction of my country or my city for the system of my citizens or the people that inhabit society?
Yeah, right. I mean, exactly. And I think AI as the new kind of fundamental knowledge worker is just such a profound shift. And it's one that, it's impossible for anyone to get their head around right now. We're not ready for it. It's impossible for us to fully conceptualize what that world looks like. But time and again, when I write about the exponential age, when I write about these big shifts that are coming, I find myself writing about the way information flows are weaving themselves through everything, including everything in the physical environment, and the way that necessitates a layer of intelligence, and it can only be artificial intelligence, over everything. And that leads me to that fundamental characterization that I talked about at the top of the show. What is the exponential age? It's about a strange new merging of information and the physical world, the digital space and the physical space. Information almost becomes a new kind of physical property. Intelligence almost becomes something akin to a new kind of energy that does a form of infrastructure that does work on all that information. I mean, these are just deep, profound shifts. And that's why I think your focus on data is so important. The big example I love to give is the way that, if we build a renewable energy network based on wind, solar, and it's highly networked, constantly streaming data all the time, the only way, which the coming edge fossil fuels, the only way we manage that energy network is via artificial intelligence. So data, AI become fundamental to the production, even just of energy, which is the foundation of everything, right?
Yeah, agree. And ultimately that will also become how we manage day-to-day living. Even if you look at 6G networks that are positioned for 10 years' time, they're all going to be built with AI from the ground up. Self-regulating, managing energy distribution, all of these aspects are going to be governing and changing the world as we know it. So you're absolutely right. All of this is going to power a whole new economy and a whole new way of living. And data's at the center. I often use the term smart economies, and ultimately that's the basis of all of this. And data is just one of those components that are going to make this work.
Yeah, I should say, I know viewers will hear a little background noise from your end, and that's because, you very kindly agreed to join us from a conference at which you've just given a keynote on these very subjects. So,
I know. I'm battling, I have to be honest with the viewers, I'm battling battery issues, and I'm battling a room full of people at a seamless event. So I'm hoping and praying my battery lasts.
This is how fresh the insights are. You're fresh from the stage to Real Vision to talk about this, and it is deeply appreciated. So
I'm going to tell the audience right now, I'm going to advise you, if I lose you, I will be back in 5 minutes, I promise.
Yeah, you'll be back. You'll be back. If only you had an AI to manage your laptop battery. So we've got this super network of networks. We've got a networked physical environment of buildings, autonomous vehicles, people, objects, streaming relentless tsunamis of data at us. The role that AI is playing is as a form of infrastructure, sort of managing those information flows, drawing insight out of them that we can use, or often the AI will just simply autonomously use that insight to, for example, manage the energy grid or manage, supply chains. You'll have factory robots talking to autonomous vehicles about delivery times and about, all of that kind of stuff. A networked world on a scale that is hard to fully conceptualize now. Before we move on to the big next stage, there's so much hype right now and so much conversation about generative AI in particular. Does that play a particular role here in data creation and in the management of the data?
Yeah, I think so. Look, the AI story is fascinating because without data, there is no generative AI. There is no AI in the first place. There's no models to operate on. There's nothing that can be materialized. I think generative AI, as we know it to be getting closer to the predicted singularity, will generate its own data for its own purposes and its own use cases. So I think, yes, generative AI plays a role. We're not quite there yet. Starting to emerge, the conversations are happening. But absolutely, it'll be a cornerstone to it because ultimately it'll be self-sustaining. It will be consuming its own data, but also consuming data from ecosystems that other AI agents or even communities of people in practice are going to be creating. So all of these elements form the basis of what are going to power next generation intelligence. And data will be the cornerstone of that. And AI in harmony, in essence, is, I'm going to use the word, and it's taken me this long to use it, metaverse and so on, is doesn't exist without AI and data. Without it, there is no metaverse, and there is no virtual reality, and there is nothing in between. So that's why all of this is so critical. And those two elements, the AI component and the data component, are going to transform everything that we've known.
Yeah. And of course, we're going to get on towards the end to dive in a little bit into how this journey and how this epic story you're telling is investable, what investors out there can do about it. But you've mentioned the word metaverse. We had to get there eventually. That does bring me on to the big third step, because as I said, we've got this epic super network in the physical environment, streaming data. We've got AI managing all that data. But then this huge third component steps into the story, and that is the emergence of virtual worlds, simulations of the metaverse, as we were talking about, like in 21, 22. What role does this play? How is this? Let's just set the scene here. How is this connected to data? Why is data an important part of the emergence of virtual worlds and the metaverse and simulations?
So I'm going to give a plug for my book now, because the book is called The Augmented World. And ultimately, what Apple did, as I said at the top of the hour, is that they created the next channel, and it won't be, in my view, yes, virtual reality will have a place, because it will give us the opportunity to go to new areas and new spaces, maybe before we go there. So Hong Kong Airport recently just built an entire metaverse of the airport, for example. But actually, what will supercharge this whole world is augmented reality, because it'll be the augmented and the shifting between the real world and the physical world in our own realities that'll actually make all of this come to life and make the metaverse a real thing in the real world. I don't think we'll be sitting in our rooms with big headsets on like Black Mirror. I think those days are not going to happen. Yes, they have their place. We may do meetings in this space. We may play games. But the reality is it's the glasses and the blending of the digital world with the physical world is what's going to make all this real. And you ask why data is important, because data is the thing that brings all of this to life. Data and information is being overlaid onto the real world. And it's ultimately, this is what we will interact with as human beings. Gone are the days where I will have to wander around a supermarket and wonder where things are, because digital wayfinding will tell me the way. Cities will be geo-fenced, and effectively I will walk into a city and it will know it's me, because the data will be from where I left it. And the augmented reality elements will navigate me around spaces. So my personal data, the data I carry me, my non-verbal data, the verbal data, all of this will be transformed into virtual augmented experiences. So this is the bit that no one is talking about, which in essence is the whole thing that powers this new world that we're going to be operating in is data. And AI will be the facilitator of that data. And even the role of digital wallets in terms of how we store that data. So, to answer your question, I think it's the engine that's actually going to power all of these virtual physical worlds, be it digital twins, be it virtual cities, or even our augmented world, is all going to be personalized, is all going to be driven by all of this.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's so true. And, I think a big part of the story with virtual worlds and with the metaverse is we just saw this incredible wave of hype in 2020 and 2021. And obviously, everything that transpired with Facebook and the name change and all of that. And that engendered an inevitable backlash, which we're still amid. And people have given themselves permission often to be like, oh, the metaverse, that was all like a load of rubbish. Like, I don't need to pay any attention to that. It was all a load of hype. It was all just a load of kids in Roblox or Fortnite. And it's such a gravely mistaken point of view. Like, I understand where it comes from, and I can understand how it can seem that way if you're not paying close attention. I get that that's been the big narrative and it's easy to swallow it. But I would just really encourage people, for example, to look at what's happening now with NVIDIA's Omniverse technology, where they're working, for example, with BMW to build simulations in virtual space of entire BMW factories, allowing BMW to just transform the way they operate utterly. I mean, if you listen to BMW, they'll tell you that a huge part of their process and a huge challenge for them is constant reconfiguration of their factories around new car models and personalized car models and this and that. They're constantly reconfiguring factories, and it takes days and it's really painful. Now they can do those reconfigurations in virtual space. They can simulate the entire factory, test reconfigurations in the simulation, get it right, and then roll it out. And that is just, if you listen to them, utterly transformative. And they're building a big, electric car factory in Hungary now, and they're just going to simulate the entire factory will have a kind of digital twin that they'll use to manage the physical factory. And we're going to see more and more and more of that via NVIDIA's Omniverse and via other, forms of virtual space. And exactly, data is the engine of it all. The reason they simulate the factory because they've connected every part of it streaming data, and they use that data to build a virtual model of the factory in virtual space that is profoundly useful.
So David, the virtual space is also giving them the ability to train people before the factory is even built. So the power of this is, look, it takes years to build a factory, even retool one. So imagine I can now personalize that whole training experience, regardless of level of experience. And using non-verbal data, I can understand if you didn't understand a particular piece of equipment, something didn't resonate with you. Maybe there's fear. So all of a sudden now I'm using non-verbal data inside a meta environment to actually drive personalized training and engagement. So even the things that BMW have done will be ultimately transformed by then making them augmented. Because now me as a human, I'm embedded into virtual spaces, and I can engage with things, even it's personal. No matter my learning style, my learning skill, even language will be translated into my eye line. So not even language will be a barrier. I can engage with maybe foreign workers in a factory that is completely virtual, or I can even bring experts teleported into my environment through holographic projections, which, by the way, is already happening. And again, all fueled by data.
Right. Yeah. And I just think the profound usefulness of these virtual spaces and these simulations is deeply underestimated right now. And that is one of the reasons why this idea that the metaverse, I can forget about that, it was all a load of hype, is just so profoundly mistaken. Amazon are using Omniverse to simulate their fulfillment centers. Kroger's, I think it is in the US, is using Omniverse to simulate retail spaces and customer flows around retail spaces. And then, as you say, once you can simulate these environments, you can do all kinds of stuff in them. Exactly as you say, you can reconfigure physical spaces, you can train human beings, all of that kind of stuff. In the end, where does this head? It feels to me that this super network of connected objects allows us to build a form of mirror world, like a one-to-one simulation of essentially the entire world in virtual space. Is that the long-term direction of travel here?
So I'm being kicked out, I think. So I think, David, everything is radically going to change, even with travel, our life. The whole data story is profound in many different ways. So yeah, I think we're on the cusp of something that we couldn't have imagined.
So
you're breaking up. Sorry, that's why I didn't cover that very well.
No problem. I know. Yeah, I can hear a little bit of a commotion going on back there. So we talked about the emergence of this mirror world, worlds in virtual space fueled by this endless tsunami of data. Let's get to, as I said, to the business end of your thesis, which is really about data becoming a new form of value, data becoming, I think it's fair to say, currency. I don't know if you would agree with me about data becoming a form of money. I don't know if that pushes it too far. But talk us through your central ideas here. How does this happen in the world we've described? We've set the scene. How does this now play out?
So I think, no, I'm comfortable. Like I said, dig into this a bit more. So I think, honestly, one of the interesting things that's come out of the Web3 world is the whole concept of tokenization, where data will become an asset. So in essence, data will become a token. So we're already seeing Web3 companies who are turning data into tokens and trading them in smart contracts. So data itself will become tokenized like any other asset that's happening right now. To give you an idea, even today, so I'm at the Seamless event today. That's the event I was keynoting at today. And I literally, just before this call, had a conversation with someone building a data exchange where they're using smart contracts to move data around to save regulators with their reporting. So they're now tapping into Web3 technology to turn data into something that can be utilized and distributed. So in essence, as people start to physically own their own data, I will be trading it with you to allow you to use it. So let me give you a real world example to bring this to life. Today, I freely give my data away to credit check me. In the future, I might say, well, actually, I'll lend you my data for this credit check. And if you want any more data from me, you need to pay me through my smart contract. And my data is tokenized and has a timestamp of how long I'm going to lend that data to you for. And taking this even further, maybe a data trust is managing that data for me. Because actually now my bank or Amazon has now become a data trust. Because now I own my own data. Guess what? I'm not going to own it myself. I'm going to give it to someone that I trust who's going to look after it for me like a custodian in the traditional banking world that's going to be my fiduciary and is going to manage all my data as an asset in a portfolio that's effectively going to be managed. And this is the world that we're heading to. And all of this is not by accident. It's these combinations of technologies, the combinations of the Web3 world is basically lifting data up into a first-class citizen again, probably for the first time in our lifetime, where it will become a traded currency. And there are so many different players. I know we're going to come on to investing a bit later, but there are so many organizations now and technology companies emerging who are playing a role in all these different facets. Who are making this data item move like a currency across a virtual layer. And it's basically going to become one of the strongest liquidity items that we've seen.
I mean, it's mind-blowing. And so think of me as a consumer. The value of the data I have, right, is what? It's because it's behavioral data about, and taste data and preference data and identity data that tells organizations who I am and what I like, what I've bought in the past, what I've done in the past, what I'm interested in. Is that the kind of data you're talking about that will be valuable to, businesses out there that will essentially pay me for my data? Is that the big picture here, or is that just one part of what we're talking about?
I think it's one part. Yes, that is definitely one use case, because today we just give it away freely.
Right.
All jokes considering, I'll go onto Facebook and I'll give my data away to see what I'd look like when I'm 60. No one really understands that the terms and conditions of giving your data away for that picture is giving someone access to your data to do all sorts with from an advertising and so on. So yes, there's the taking the data back and putting it into my hands as a consumer and me deciding how I'm going to use that and how I'm going to spend it. That's definitely one use case. The second use case is I use my data to generate experiences and environments and virtual spaces. So companies will reach out to you because your data is valuable. And I think this is an important topic when we talk about data value. And now Tim and I have talked about this a lot from Hold On, in the sense of, I know he talks about data storage and it's running out and we need to only keep what's important. But then as you start digging down that rabbit hole, not all data is equal. So some data will be valuable in utility and some data will be valuable in exchange. And not all data will be valuable in the same environment, because there's probably too much of it. So the value it's really like diamond. The value of that data is worthless to me because there's too much of it. It's like water. Whereas in some environments, data is so scarce, that same data set all of a sudden now is valuable to that environment. So we will start to see new value systems for data. We will see so many different use cases where data, which was previously freely available, is no longer in people's control other than mine as the consumer. So all the experiences we take for granted, all the uses of data that's created is all of a sudden going to become an item of scarcity. Even though it's in abundance, its scarcity will be driven by the people that own it.
So you have the aspect of this that's sort of like my personal data, behavioral data, purchase history, taste and preference data, media consumption, all of that is valuable to third-party organizations. Basically, you want to sell me stuff, and they're going to start, and I will start to have ways to control that data, to own that data, and draw value from it, to essentially license it or sell it to third parties. And I'm fascinated by the other big dimension of this you talked about, which is, if we're saying that virtual worlds and virtual spaces are fueled by data, they're constructed out of data essentially, then perhaps my data, or the data my house is creating, or the data all the houses on my street are creating, or whatever it is, are needed to help fuel a simulation or a virtual world in virtual space. And you'll have organizations essentially saying, let me use your data as the building blocks of the simulation or the virtual space I want to construct. Have I got that right?
That's absolutely spot on. And this is a conversation I have with customers all the time, is that, look, everybody talks about digital twins. There's this concept of a connected digital twin where I can bind twins to solve a problem. But let's be honest, not every business in the world is going to create a digital twin. The reality is, though, they may look to people like you and I to say, well, actually, I need your data to finish off my digital twin because I'm trying to solve this particular problem, and your data would be useful. Or if you're a business, maybe you hold transactional data, for example. So maybe transactional data might be interesting to someone who's trying to run scenarios, maybe for a future city, for example. They're trying to understand the influx of people coming into more urban areas. So what does that mean for the financial system? So you may be a bank, you may be a financial institution, and I can give you my data as an API. So I'll give you that API, and then I'll charge you for it, and then you can then use that within your simulation. So what we're starting to see is almost like new economies emerge based on the data that businesses just hold anyway, where they can now turn that into an API, they can give it to an organization, and all of a sudden it's now a new revenue line. Eventually it becomes a new business. So that's either for the business angle or for the consumer, they're playing an active part in all of this, in terms of their contributions, in terms of maybe helping organizations. And even maybe it doesn't have to be, a business, a commercial business. It could be a public sector, a public service. So it could be a city that's creating a virtual version of itself to understand or solve a particular public problem. And that me as an individual, I may want to be part of that, which then speaks to the power of community and the role of your data in DAOs and so on. And by the way, there are already things called, I forget the name, but they pool data together, data unions. There you go. So a data union already exists in the Web3 world, where like-minded people pull personal data together into a data pool, and it's sold on a smart contract on an exchange, and everybody in that pool is rewarded. These are the sorts of models that are emerging that are going to power some of the things that we've been talking about for the last 40 or so minutes. But the important thing is that all of this is real. This is happening right now. And the signals that we're seeing are pointing to something much more profound, which is why I'm excited by all of this and optimistic about it. But at the same time, I'm fortunate to be having this conversation with you and your viewers, because I also want to speak to regulators, and I also want to speak to the people who need to now be on the front foot and be the enablers of this ecosystem versus trying to play catch up.
Right. There's so much going on in there. I think the emergence of, as you say, of platforms that empower people to find others who they could combine their data with, and then the value of that combined data is sort of greater than the sum of the parts, essentially to kind of create a sort of instant pop-up sort of data business with others, because you have a fragment of data, they have fragments of data, and if you put it all together, you get the entire puzzle that's deeply valuable to, I don't know, whoever, like British Airways or IBM, or the central government that's trying to plan the road system, because they want the data that your car is constantly streaming, because they want to simulate the London road system in real time, 24/7 in virtual space, and they need your data to do that. I think that's going to be massive. So this remakes the economy, right? And it remakes the banking system. Am I right? And then there's huge regulatory questions around all of.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought up the financial system, and it changes things, because let's just think how the money markets work today, right? I have a need. So I am the demand side of the market. The merchants and retailers now are the supply side because they meet that demand. And then the market will dictate the value of that item. Now let's move into a world where I own the data. I am now the supply side. The merchant is now the demand because now I own the data. And then the market will determine the value of that data, whether that data is valued in bits and bytes or it's valued at a token level. And today we exchange goods and services through fiat currency. In the world of tomorrow where people own their own data, guess what? We'll be using tokens and smart contracts as our means of how we exchange that. So all of this has the potential to basically turn, and this is kind of takes us full circle. This is probably a whole other conversation altogether, but this is really unpacking what we know to be value. This is really the nub of all of this, is that what we know to be value is changing. Data is becoming a form of value, as is our reputation, as is cryptocurrency, as even our core values themselves will be a form of value that will be exchanged. And data is one of this magic circle, if you like, of universal value exchange and how value is fundamentally changing. And a lot of this is being driven by the Web3 world, but I think also this is being driven by a generation and a segment of consumer that most businesses haven't met yet, but are already engaging in this world of the Roblox and so on, where their view on value is very different to you and I.
Right. Yeah, exactly that. I mean, and I think, if people could, not just take a look at, for example, what's happening in Fortnite or what's happening in Roblox or what's happening in, Meta's Horizon world or whatever, and just dismiss it, but try and think about the underlying principles here and the, as you say, the underlying signals that those examples are sending us. It does point to just a profound shift that, as you say, what at heart is this shift? It's about remaking of fundamental things. And one of the fundamental things being remade is what is value itself? What is valuable? What is value? And I just think it's so deeply important to understand that on a sort of underlying level, when information becomes a part of the world around us, when the infosphere, the world of information and the physical world kind of merge, information becomes a form of value. That essentially would be the way I would sum up this shift on a deep, like, philosophical level, if that's not too grandiose.
No, I think you're absolutely right. I think, look, we've been on this journey for a long time. We've never realized it. The reality is the metaverse, all of the things that we talk about weren't by accident. Like, virtual reality has existed since the 90s. Open banking has been around for 7-8+ years. 5G networks have appeared on the horizon. Machine learning and AI, you could argue, are maybe 20+ years old. So all of these things have converged at exactly the same time. And they've given us the ability now to, through convergence, through exponential growth and combination, have given us what we know to be the augmented world and virtual realities. And all of these elements and pieces have just basically given us the new materials to reshape what value is, but also how we interact as people, which is why I keep going back to what happened 2-3 weeks ago was incredibly profound. What Apple did was they created the next channel. That's ultimately what they did. They also reshaped what we know, how we prove our identities through our eyes. They introduced so many new technologies, which I'm not sure most people could really grasping what this really means. Because like they did with the iPhone, like they did with the iPad, and what other industries have done before us, they've now created a pivotal moment for us, which is in the next 2 to 3 years. Yes, Apple, they're not going to be the sole driver of this ecosystem, but they just did something incredibly profound. They put this into the public conversation for the first time. People now will be talking about this and expecting these experiences. And this is the world that we're moving to. And, I truly believe regulators and businesses are not yet prepared for what is coming, which, as I think you've alluded to, is a tsunami of data, which is going to need to be managed or rethought in terms of how we look at it.
Yeah. And I agree. I think the Apple Vision Pro could turn out to be a hugely important moment here if they really have nailed the user experience when it comes to augmented reality. this ability to drop a digital layer over the physical environment, which is essentially exactly what I'm talking about, what we're talking about, the merging of digital and physical. So you have, obviously the physical environment around you, and then you can drop digital artifacts, a digital layer over that environment, and the two essentially become one. And then anything that's manifested in your data, you can manifest as a sort of object out there in your view. And then you can share that with others. And the two just start to merge in really important ways. I mean, this becomes, speculative, but do we get to a place, in your opinion, where a person's data, or an average person's data, is more valuable than their labor, than their work? Is this part of how we approach some form of like post-work world?
Yeah, I think it does, but I also think there's a cautionary tale there too. So we still live in the world of financial inclusion as an issue, in terms of people don't have access to smartphones. There's still a large percentage of the population that are unbanked because they don't have identities. I think what we'll start to see as devices get smaller, we will solve that inclusion problem when it comes to data. But I think in the medium to short term, we still have a sustainability responsibility. And I don't mean the environment. I mean giving everybody access to create a data footprint, everybody access to monetize their data or have something that's valuable, because there's a real danger that we'll create an even bigger divide than we see in financial services. And I think this is where the regulator piece comes in, which is because I think the other piece, to keep on the thread, is people with accessibility needs. How do you create an inclusive piece when it comes to data? Because these experiences are real, right? And if you're amplifying these and you've got an accessibility condition, these are some of the things that we need to tease out. But you're right, data will become something incredibly valuable and more important than labor. And could it become a form of UPI? Could it be a basis of, look, you have more data than this person, so I'll give you this, and that could be the way that you navigate the new world. I think all bets are off right now and everything is up for grabs. I think what we're witnessing is the changing of the guard. So it's no longer about how powerful the computer is. It's no longer how much storage we need. It's actually what's the value in the data, and how do we keep this liquidity on hand, and how can we use it effectively? And I think once we solve that issue, then we'll probably solve the question of, is this more important than labor? Because then we'll truly, as a society, understand the value of this thing, which, by the way, we've neglected since we first created the computer.
Right. And this is why I think coming at the exponential age from the angle of, or through the lens of, you might say, data and information is so fruitful, because you end up in deep, deep questions around what is the nature of value, what is the nature of and meaning of work and the function of work or human labor in our societies. Big questions that form a part of the kind of big picture puzzle that any macro economist, someone like Raoul, is constantly trying to put together, constantly trying to make sense of the big picture. Okay. I mean, we could talk for hours, and we're of course going to get you back.
Yeah.
And
because I just want to add, by the way, you talked about data numbers, and I didn't give you any stats, and that's probably because of me moving around and batteries dying. But let me just give you some numbers just to sort of really back some of this up. So we'll be, by 2025, creating a data footprint every 18 seconds. So I just wanted you to comprehend that number. 90% of the world's data was created in the last 2 years. That's a fact. While you and I have just been having this conversation for the last minute, 5 million people search Google. So I just bear that in mind of some of the numbers. These are just absolutely mind-boggling numbers. The numbers are comparable. Well, they're numbers that we've never seen in our lifetime. And this is the stuff that's starting to hit home. And, the exponential age is the right vehicle for this, because the numbers are exponential in terms of the growth that we're seeing. And it's going to create markets. It's going to bring down businesses who just don't have the capability to participate. We talk to clients all the time in my current role about the emergence of open data, but most companies are still struggling to deal with the world of open payments and open banking and so on. So there's a real danger here that as the regulator continues to push the dial, businesses will fall further by the wayside because they don't have compelling value propositions and abilities to tap into this new value exchange and this new form of liquidity.
Right. And for anyone who's listening, who's, as I always say, skepticism is good. I like to come from a place of skepticism. We need to interrogate everything we hear right now as we try to make sense of this enormous shift. But for anyone who's just deeply skeptical about this idea that, data has value, data can become a form of currency, I just really encourage them to look at how, already it's ancient history that $100 billion businesses have been built on people's personal data. And I'm, of course, thinking primarily about Facebook. The money printing machine at Facebook or at Meta now is still the advertising business. And that's a business built on selling, organizations from huge corporations to kind of mom and pop, little corner stores, access to data that lets them target advertising. It's a data business. The data has real value. And like we all know that. And there's been so much conversation about the ethics of that and how that's played out. But think about the deeper implications of it, which I think you are doing such a brilliant job of tapping into. Now, I want to go to some audience questions, and I want to get to them in particular because they include the big question that I promised. We talk about. Gordon Foreman says, we should deal with this one quite quickly. Just like the technical difficulties we had earlier, what happens if the internet goes down in this brave new world of a super network of networks and data as value?
I always use this great analogy when I excuse the background noise because the conference is closing. I use this great analogy. So if you think of the financial crisis, governments knew what to do because, rightly or wrongly, they printed more money, and it was a thing that we invented, right? We invented money. So in theory, we know what to do in principle. I would argue if Google fell over tomorrow, we wouldn't know what to do because it's so ubiquitous and part of our life. Google is a great example. And it's a great question, by the way, because Google is a great example of how pervasive data has become. None of us can probably get from A to B without Google Maps. Guess what? That's all powered by data. No one ever reads the terms and conditions, by the way, because they're too busy because the value exchange is too high. Our spelling, most people wouldn't have a job if they could without Google because they wouldn't be able to spell. So a lot of the things like the internet has become so ubiquitous and part of our life, as you saw earlier. Like I lost a connection, albeit for a very short period, but it was a big disruption. So I think a lot of this is going to require, and this is the infrastructure story, which is the next generation infrastructures. And I say infrastructures because there's not one. There's going to be many that'll be up and running that this data layer is going to run across. And many networks, whether it's I walk into a city and I'm connecting to a drone that's going to be my network, whether it's a 5G network, whether it's a 6G network, it's going to be many, many infrastructures that are going to be up and running that are going to ensure that people like me don't lose my laptop connection.
Yeah, right. And this talk of infrastructure, the infrastructure that underpins all this and allows it to happen, my sense is probably forms a part of the answer to this second question, the question I had. Bob Geyer says, yeah, sure, data has value. The challenge or part of the challenge for the Real Vision viewers out there, part of the reason they tune in are, what are the investable parts of this journey? What should I do about it as an investor? Now, I don't think we're about to give like super concrete investment advice here, right? But what are your broad brushstroke thoughts on those questions? I would tend to think about the infrastructure that allows all of this to happen.
Yeah, so I'll bear with me in the noise, by the way.
Sure.
So there's a few areas, and actually they're already in stock exchanges markets that you can invest in today. So the companies like Matterport, the people who are building, the Nvidias of this world who are building the platforms that we're going to operate on. But I also think there's some sort of untapped areas. So, cybersecurity, cryptography, the protection of data moving between devices. I know of companies that Google are trying to acquire who have solved the security problem when data moves between machine to machine, down to literally a field level. So it's a very, Warren Buffett will say, it's that sometimes the boring ones are the best ones. So, the enablers of this world are where I would be looking to invest. Yes, the experiences are interesting in terms of the virtual spaces, but what about fraud? What about cybersecurity? What about all the things that are going to make and fuel this place work? They're the ones that for me are the interesting players, because eventually, so I compare this to the days of the Rockefellers of the world and the Carnegies, where we're building the new railroads. The difference is where we're going, we don't need trains. These are digital railroads where data is going to run across these railroads. And in the Web3 world, what's happening is different companies are fighting for different railroads, whether it's FX, cross-border, whether it's blockchain, whatever protocols are going to win out. These will eventually become the railroads. And then effectively what the things that we've been talking about are the business models, are the data that will run ubiquitously across these railroads 24/7, which is the big difference. And that's the world that we're heading to.
Right. Yeah, it does. It is kind of hilarious sometimes that, in these exponential age conversations, so often, it becomes, it's just fascinating and it's so exciting. And then some of the conclusions about investment can feel sort of deeply unsexy. You go down to the infrastructure level. I always come back to, the providers of compute power, the chip makers, the cloud service providers. Like, think about the people that need to exist and that we need much more of to enable all of this to happen. And then I think concerns around security, security, privacy, and all of that layer of infrastructure is absolutely key as well. So there are some sort of broad brushstroke thoughts for people out there thinking, what does this journey mean for me as an investor? Okay, look, Michael, thank you so much for this conversation. Like I say, we're definitely going to have you back. We painted, I think, a broad brushstroke picture here that there's huge opportunity in future videos to dig into. To wrap up, just remind people, tell people a tiny bit about, where they can find out more about you and your work, the name of the book, when it's out.
Yeah. So LinkedIn is, again, it's a very unsexy place, but LinkedIn is probably the best place to find me. In terms of the book, I'm humbled by the whole thing. So many people are helping me sort of piece. And again, it talks to the fact that people are starting to care about this. So the book is called Data and Augmented Worlds, The Evolution of Value, which hopefully is due for spring next year. I'm really fortunate to have people like Brett King be contributing, and huge thanks to him for making the book happen. He will close out on smart economies. I've got interviews with people building digital clearing houses around the world, really, really painting a story of, the origins of how we got here to ultimately where we're going. And the book is aimed at leadership, governments, giving them the takeaways. This is not an academic book. This is a book that's going to take them on a journey to where data effectively becomes the basis of a smart economy. So that comes out next year. There'll be lots of material in the public domain, obviously further conversations like this, which, this is never going to stop. Like the exponential age, it doesn't slow down. So whilst the book comes out next spring, the world is still moving. So I'll be having lots of these conversations in the public domain, as I am doing with regulators and governments and public sector and businesses to sort of make them aware of this journey.
Fantastic. Yeah. Book out next spring, Data and Augmented Worlds. As is so often the case, Real Vision got there first. Real Vision got in there early, but I think next spring would be a fantastic time for another conversation, by which time let's just see what world we are occupying when it comes to, generative AI, data volumes, the Apple, Vision Pro. Further, I think we'll have exited the kind of metaverse winter by then, and people will have a whole different view on all of that. But for now, Michael Clark, thank you so much for joining us. Fascinating conversation. Thanks for bearing with us through the conference distractions. It's deeply appreciated.
Anytime.
And see you again soon.
Lovely to see you. Take care now.
We hope you enjoyed the video. At Real Vision, we help you understand the complex world of finance, business, and the global economy with in-depth analysis from real experts. Join the revolution at realvision.com.